Welcome to the Ad Astra podcast. Today we have with us researcher Liana Saif. She has researched and been written and researching a lot of things on Islamicate, esotericism and occult philosophies. So she has a lot of work done in this area. She's currently a postdoctoral fellow at the RC project PhilAnd, which explores the philosophy of in Al-Andalus, in medieval Al-Andalus, the transmissions, the impacts, and all of that dynamics. And it's a project which is sponsored by the Université catholique de Louvain, and in partnership with the Warburg Institute. Welcome.
Welcome, Liana.
Welcome, Liana. Thank you. Glad to have you here.
I have to say it's a great pleasure to have you, since you were my teacher and colleague at Warburg. And it's good to see you again.
It's great to see you too. Thank you for having me. It's great pleasure.
Yes. So, there's a lot of things that we want to ask you and to talk with you. But please let us know a little bit about your work and first in your research work, your objectives in your research work.
Sure. Well, I started working on the Islamic influences on early modern occult philosophy. I did my PhD on that subject, and ultimately that led to the publication of my first monograph, The Arabic Influences in Early Modern Occult Philosophy. So at the beginning, I was more Renaissance studies. I was looking at important figures in Renaissance occult philosophy, such as Marsilio Ficino, Pico della Mirandola, Giordano Bruno, John Dee, Agrippa, and also tackling some medieval figures such as Albertus Magnus and even Thomas Aquinas. So the emphasis was on the way in which Islamic, esoteric, and occult ways of knowing affected and influenced European ideas in occult philosophy. And it turns out that astrology and astral magic had a great impact, particularly on the philosophization of occult sciences in the European early modern period. And after that, this experience drove it closer in my mind that there's a lot left to be done in the Islamic side of things. At that point, there wasn't a lot of people who were doing research on the Islamic material for several reasons, one of which is quite simple. The manuscripts are, despite them being everywhere around us in Europe, but there wasn't enough support of the topic as a legitimate academic topic for people to investigate it. The occult and the esoteric was still looked at from a positivist post-enlightenment lens, where it measured the value of the research that we do in terms of that binary of rationality versus superstition. And in general, our material was pulled more towards the irrational and the superstitious. And the Islamic material, even though we did have Orientalist research dealing with it, but it's often either through some sort of exoticization or trying to find value by looking at how much Greek material was preserved in the Islamic material, and kind of like distract us from how original these materials were in themselves, and how the ancient material became part of an Islamic way of thinking, rather than the Islamic material being just a vessel of transmission that then gave the valuable material to the West in the Renaissance, and then Islam and Muslims became irrelevant unless politically. So you know, I wanted at that stage to start paying attention to the Islamic material beyond just a super like philological attention, but actually look at the epistemological foundations that are historically contingent at especially the early medieval period, which is what my specialty, from the 8th to the 12th century. And after that, I just focused on that material mostly, and never looked back. But I do miss the Renaissance stuff.
Yes.
So what you just focused is one of the probably one of the big misunderstandings about Islamic culture, and specifically Islamic astrology and Islamic hermeticism, is that people think that still think that the Islamic culture was like a vessel, as you said, and then has contributed with nothing relevant, which is, I think, extremely unfair.
yeah, for sure.
We're exploring all the contributions.
Yes, it's even in astrology. You still have a lot. You have a huge, undeniable Arabic influence. Arabic influence in the practice of astrology in the West, and still there are the Greeks.
And there's the Renaissance.
There's the Renaissance and the Latin,
and then there's this uncomfortable
area
in between.
Yeah, and then decline, like that decline narrative, you know.
Yeah, they say the same about Middle Ages in general. It's like the Dark Ages, and so this is an idea that should be really clarified, unintended.
And restructured. I think we're still suffering from that denial and expurging of Arabic, supposedly Arabic influences in knowledge. Of astrology specifically, that happened in 16th century, late 15th, 16th century, and I think it has been so ingrained in the mindset and the history that we still haven't got rid of it completely.
No, and I mean, in the realm of academia, these narratives have been challenged for a long time. And, you know, the decline narrative is generally unaccepted right now. But the ramification of that way of thinking extends beyond academia. You know, people in general still adopt that idea that Islam was once great in the golden age when, you know, we had the Greek sciences and when we translated, and then after the 12th century, things started declining, and there was no production of either decent astronomical, astrological, or any scientific material. When in fact, science, you know, a lot of scholars have shown that that is not the case. Whether it was history of science, so Professor Sonia Brenches has highlighted that. In the terms of the occult sciences, Matthew Melvin Kushki has written about Persianate scientific production in different contexts. You have Noah Gardner, who talked about the Mamluk context as well, and so this has been, you know, it's been challenged, and we continue to challenge it. But because astrology has that power to reach people from beyond academia, more than, let's just say, physics or even astrology, it fascinates people because of the power of the stars. We look up and we start giving it meaning, whether we believe in astrology or not. That's just how it is. The universe is so majestic and unbelievably unfathomable that we're going to look up and we're going to give it meaning, and it's going to give us meaning back, and we're going to interpret it whether we're astrologers or not. So because astrology has this power, it's important to take those narratives that are challenged in academia and put it out there so that people can understand better the value of the science of the stars, ilm al-nujum, rather than just like astronomy and astrology. It was, the science of the stars. And one of the things that I like about what you do is that you highlight these processes, the importance of these medieval techniques in interpreting our relationship with the universe around us. And that return to this medieval mindset is not something that we should be afraid of because it's the Middle Ages. It's, we use medieval to this day, oh, that's so medieval. Oh,
like a
derogatory thing. But it can also mean a time of different way of thinking or different epistemological approaches that were co-present with each other.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Right? So they were not condemned by a binary that has a lot of colonial baggage as well, and imperialistic baggage. They had their own baggage, like it's not, but in terms of that return to a place where the act of living is understood as the act of interpreting from different perspectives, I think there's a lot of value in that.
Absolutely, absolutely. I always say to people that if we learn and understand that astrology was not only something that people did, like they believed in this and some practice, but also a way of understanding the universe and ourselves. And this can coexist. And in fact, it can contribute to our life in the 21st century. We don't need to be less rational or whatever, intelligent. We just need to understand and change from one mindset to the other. And that will make us more complete as humans. So when you say this about medieval knowledge or about the Islamic medieval knowledge specifically, I think it is such a loss if we just ignore it. And I know in academia this doesn't happen, but even in everyday life, for co-educated people, if they just could understand how much we have of them in us, that would be very, very interesting. And your work is kind of absolutely crucial for this.
Thank you. I mean, it's I find value in this research exactly because it does challenge. It challenged me as someone who is active in our times. It poses a challenge. I mean, I do ask questions about what this could mean to me now, with the way that science, the discipline of science, especially in the West, how it developed. What does astrology mean to me? I mean, it's a great challenge, but it can be a great challenge to have.
Yeah.
To look at the past through the stars, because it's not something that we're just doing now. It's something that has been done. The stars and the sky are places where political aspirations are broadcast, where personal fears and anxieties manifest, where scientific thinking is in action. Like the material that I study, especially the theoretical aspect of astrology when you read Abu Ma'shar al-Balkhi, or in Astral Magic when you read Ghayat al-Hakim, they are dealing with scientific questions such as action at a distance. You know, you had Aristotle saying that action at a distance cannot happen. So you had these Aristotelian astrologers having to grapple with that. Well, if action at a distance cannot happen, so how are the stars affecting? Why do the tides take place? So despite indeed them not being science in the way that we understand science now, but they were still grappling with phenomena that is important to science today. Action at a distance, intuition. Intuition is still a subject that is fiercely debated in medicine. How much is diagnosis and informed intuition? And for example, if you look at medieval literature and early modern literature on physiognomy, for example, intuition plays a really important role, hads. And it comes with all the anxieties that you see in medical discourse right now. Because intuition is subjective, how do we make sure that when we're diagnosing, that we're closer to the truth as possible? So they were aware of these problems and these boundaries that are, you know, problems that are existent in modern science now. So in one way they are different, but in other ways they were the same, you know. And even like, I'm sure you know Al-Kindi's Diradis, right, on astral rays. And it was taking the field of magic, invocation, sacrifice, and all these elements that you see in magical practices, and trying to look at them as things, as acts that has potential to explain action at a distance. So for Al-Kindi, rays must have been that vehicle, that physical vehicle, because, you know, adherence to also the Aristotelian idea that action at a distance doesn't happen. So sacrifice was understood powerful because of a network of rays, not only astral but elementary, that the act of like killing an animal is going to cause a disruption in this network, and therefore like action, you know, action, immediate action is preserved. And with Abu Ma'shar taking the Aristotelian notions of motion and heat and friction, can establish that the stars influence because this motion produces heat, produces blah blah, and therefore, you know, it's still the same questions that we ask today.
Questions, yes. And also not only scientific but also everyday life. I'm thinking of the book The Last Pagans of Iraq.
Oh yeah,
Nabatean agriculture. I managed to find it and read it. It's absolutely fascinating because they teach how to be a better farmer by using magic and astrology. So it is also for everyday life, specifically for medicine also, but for other purposes as well.
I mean, you reminded me of something that I actually was reading yesterday. So I'm working on, as part of the PhilAnd project, the ERC project at the Warburg and the Université Catholique de Louvain. I'm focusing on a very understudied text attributed to, you know, the great scientist and alchemist Jabir ibn Hayyan. And it's called Kitab al-Nukhab, the book of selections or the compendium. And it's about the science of talismans, and doesn't contain instructions, but it's set up as a teaching material for why the science of talisman works and why it is important. And the author goes as far as to say that talismans is making talismans is basically an artificial act imitating natural acts. And he reaches that conclusion from the thought that when people saw processes like fermentation, like spontaneous generation, when they saw natural processes taking place, that made them think of how we can use these processes for immediate benefits, for farming, for medicine, for all kinds of useful things. And he goes as far as to say that magic and astrology were actually the vehicles and the conduits for science in the Islamic world, because people saw natural things and needed to recreate them artificially.
Yeah.
And that impulse
Yes.
is science. I mean, he calls that ilm and hikmah, science and wisdom.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So to attribute our understanding of science, that 19th century understanding of science, to impose that, on the earlier material, we also lose sight of how science was conceptualized then.
Absolutely.
And the science conceptualized then accommodates physiognomy, divination, astrology, alchemy. But we'd have to see it as much as we can, because obviously we don't have access to the past in the way that we would like to, but as much as possible, just to open our minds to our lenses that we put on when we read works on the occult sciences.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I think we have a 19th century
Still, yeah.
blockage there that needs to be bypassed quite intelligently, so we can access really a way of thinking and the way that all of these knowledges exist in a certain cultural and mindset that's completely different from our own. And it's the old problem of the wretched sciences. So the losers on the war against rationality.
The light of rationality.
And enlightenment, yes, and it's true. A lot of the role of astrology, for example, needs to be understood in that context. And for example, the other day I was giving a lecture on the uses of astrology, and it's quite recent in historical terms. So I was talking about 17th century, and even so, I felt the need to clarify the audience, because this was a public lecture. What exactly are we talking about when we're talking about astrology in that specific period? And people need to know that, because if you present them with astrology,
if you just drop the word like astrology,
they will
think of something.
They will immediately access what today is understood of astrology, with all of the mental bias that comes with it. So they won't be able to understand why we're talking about these practices and validating a certain practice at a certain time,
and also
which doesn't exist today. So we need to break that.
Also, they will put it in this binary frame, like believing or not believing. I believe this, okay. I don't believe this.
Yeah.
And it has nothing to do. Astrology was a way of describing the universe and all the relation between people and nature and animals and everything. So it was not about believing. Exactly. We don't question ourselves if we believe in atoms or superstrings or other things or gravity. It's just something that we use as operational concepts.
Yeah, exactly.
For them, astrology was also a way of describing the universe. Of course, it has other areas that are more connected to magic, but it's kind of a wide field.
Yeah, but even magic was a natural extension of natural philosophy, as you were just explaining, of science and knowledge and natural philosophy.
Like the natural understanding of nature and the ability to manipulate, I don't like the word, but in lack of better word, to manipulate nature for a certain purpose.
Yeah. And here we are again fighting against the 19th century. Just to try to get to explain this properly.
It's really essential to ask these questions about the influence of 19th century paradigms. Not to risk making it sound like it's this homogeneous thing, the Enlightenment, or that the Enlightenment is a period that begins a certain point and ends a certain point. That's not how I think about it. But that with, these kind of ideas and binaries of the 19th century also carried with them implication on race, implications on that were basically resulted from colonialism, and these kind of binaries were used to categorize people and groups from the perspective of the colonizer a lot of the times, but also people from beyond just the so-called West have agency in also taking those 19th century concepts and be part of the discourse on them nowadays. So when we are talking about post-enlightenment values, they are still embedded in people. So it's important to get into conversation about that and what these paradigms also mean beyond the West. Instead of just saying Western Enlightenment, the birth of reason is, a Western thing, and then astrology and the practices of all of these things in the rest of the world fits within like a supernatural, primitive mind.
Absolutely, I agree.
And a practice like astrology, which is universal, would have to be understood from the perspectives of different people. And even when we say things like, I believe this and I don't believe that, like, what do we mean by I believe in this? This also comes with a lot of baggage. And the idea of emphasizing the ambiguity of these criteria is not to confuse people, but to actually be to help us negotiate what we take for granted on every day and understand them and understand their history. Because I think when we do that, when we take that perspective of co-presence, as I mentioned earlier, what we end up emphasizing is acts, science, any engagement that we have in terms of its potentiality for personal growth, rather than just utilitarian scientific value.
Yeah, exactly. And also,
what does astrology mean to this person and why?
Exactly.
That's more important. It's better to ask, why is someone, be it an astrologer, be it a practitioner of magic in the Middle Ages or now, it's more important to ask the question of how come this person is negotiating these boundaries the way that they're doing it, rather than being dismissive of the fact that they're doing boundary work.
Absolutely, yes. And even when you emphasize the diversity of concepts, just out of curiosity, we even have Cartesian astrologers, which is kind of there was this man, Claude Gadrois. And he was like a Cartesian astrologer. So he went out of his way to explain astrology in Cartesian terms. It's kind of a very complex. And I can only interpret this as an expression of his love for astrology, because he was really trying to, to fit astrology into the Cartesian mentality, which is completely the opposite if we think of it. Just out of curiosity, as an example of diversity, and also as an example of the persistence of astrological thought and how we have it as a part of us, all of us.
Exactly. I mean, you have the old school narrative saying, well, that's just remnants of a superstitious mind. You know, at some point, you know, people thought of viruses as demons, but now we know that viruses are viruses. But that way of thinking is not helpful for understanding the Cartesian astrologer. I'm concerned of understanding how come we, you know, at this day and age, there is an astrologer who identifies as Cartesian, or a Cartesian who identifies as astrologer. That's valid.
And very interesting.
Yeah. Why? What kind of negotiations are happening? That is fascinating and legitimate and important, because it takes shape in this case with this explicit, like, astrology and, you know, a Cartesian astrologer, but it manifests in our day-to-day life every, from knocking on wood. Like, why do people knock on wood? Oh, remnants of a superstitious mind, or medieval. And I don't think so. I don't think it's just, there's something more. And that's what I am interested in, personally and as an academic.
Yeah. Yes. Oh, yeah.
So I think we addressed some of the main points. I think we could stay here forever because I love talking to you.
I do wanted to ask you about one of your projects that you were engaging, which was a translation of the Picatrix.
Yes.
How is that going?
That's going really, really well. Slower than what I would like, and slower than what a lot of people would like. But it doesn't help that I am obsessed with gathering as many manuscripts as I can of the work, because the Arabic edition by Helmut Ritter is excellent, but also the historical situation that surrounded the production of the Arabic edition and the German translation by Martin Plessner and Helmut Ritter was all over the place because of these scholars having to leave Germany because of Nazism and other situations where Helmut Ritter and Martin Plessner had to travel around a lot. So, in fact, like, if you read some of the introductory material in these two translations, it's explained that the project of studying and translating and editing the Picatrix was fraught with a lot of difficulties. But the Arabic edition is really good, but I'm not relying on it. I have more manuscripts, access to more manuscripts now than Helmut Ritter in the 20s and in the 30s. So with that means constant work, because every time to go back to the translation, but ultimately this makes for a better, more interesting translation. But it's happening soon. The idea is to submit a manuscript by the end of this year. Having said that, I did say that I would submit a manuscript by the end of last year and the year. So I am sorry. It's just like literally last month I got 2 new manuscripts from Iran. So
what you said is that you would submit the manuscript by the end of the year, but you did not say which year.
You don't need to specify which year.
It will be published. You got it.
Just one thing, speaking of translations, and before we go, just one thing that I just thought about. Do you remember when we went to the British Library and I had a copy of this Libro Completo of Halil Ben Rajel in Old Castilian, and you had a manuscript of the same book in Arabic. And in half an hour, we spotted some difficulties and a lot of mistranslations. So this is the importance of having someone who is Arab native speaker and very well acquainted with the language of science, magic, astrology, because you can, just like this, you can spot all the incongruence or differences or errors in these manuscripts. So yeah, I'm waiting for the Hayat al-Hakim. And then I have a bunch of books that I can suggest to you.
Sure, but I have to say that, obviously Arabic being my mother tongue is super helpful. But also I learned a lot from Professor Charles Burnett. This ability to read parallel texts in different languages and just zoom in those little differences with an eye, not just to point out that there are differences, and not with the eye of pointing out deviations, but rather asking the questions of why this word was used to translate that word. What was going on? Because as you know, practice of translation now has become a kind of exact science in a way that, again, cannot be applied to translation in the medieval period and a pre-modern period in general. There's a whole history for the development of translation methods and translation studies. But like translation was a different process. There were different incentives behind translating text. There were different translators from different backgrounds. And so it's, studying under and working with Professor Charles Burnett has really taught me how to use these philological skills to answer questions beyond just translation and transmission, to answer questions like the ones that we talked about earlier in terms of boundary work. Why is that word, why is that term chosen? Spiritus, animus, anima, for ruh, nafs, things like that. And these terms carry with them a lot of cultural specifics, a lot of political agendas as well. So that's why it's important actually to be able to look at these variations and not interpret them as a degeneration of text.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. I think this is one of the great contributions that Professor Charles Burnett has, is to keep an open mind and keep asking questions of this kind.
Exactly.
He doesn't settle with one. He keeps trying to understand the reason of these variations or changes or whatever you want to call them. He keeps trying to understand. So it
requires a meticulous type of scholarship that I aspire to. To see so much in the choice of words, from Arabic to Latin, from Arabic to Hebrew, from Syriac to Arabic. It's super exciting.
Well, you have a lot of work in your future. Expecting it.
I'm so lucky that I've had a mentor like Professor Charles Burnett, who has consistently reminded me how fun and exciting doing this kind of thing at a time where academia can seem suffocating, and the way that knowledge has been institutionalized feels oppressive. And even, under COVID, when we are all apart, we still have our reading group. And, he's someone who really anchors me in that idea that, I do what I do, he does what he does, you guys do what you do, because we love it. It's so engaging.
Absolutely.
It's just fun.
It is.
It is.
I always say it's a passion of the mind. It's a passion of the mind.
And we really must not lose sight of the fact that manuscripts and books and texts that we read from the past had an entertaining value, and these texts are a beautiful, entertaining spectacle. And sometimes we have to engage with this material on a whimsical level. And reading, you know, things in a manuscript on the margins, in like the pages that, you know, the blank pages that no one looks at because, you know, it's the end of text, the page before, the folio before. But, you know, we look at, you know, these manuscripts as just like beautiful objects of whimsy and entertainment. I mean, I've read poetry on, and excuse me, on farts, on manuscript, on astrology, and
You have to translate that one.
I did. I mean, I think I'm gonna mention it. Like, it was, you know, it's wonderful to be able, like, to see these like pinholes into this kind of whimsy, and not take them so seriously as
Absolutely.
that reveal something about the mind, you know, of an actual man, you know, in within the context of transmission, within the context of just old philology. You know, there's a lot on offer when we work with manuscripts, and we are very privileged that we have access in manuscripts, because, you know, I am in London, and sadly, you know, a lot of these manuscripts are in what can be described as displaced archives. And you know, there's a huge advantage and privilege that, you know, I'm in London and I have, you know, the British Library nearby. I can go to Oxford and be there in an hour. I can be in Cambridge. I can be in the BNF in Paris. I can be in Leiden and look at these manuscripts. But the creation of a canon, so to speak, from the perspective of science and religion in the West, has also meant that material in astrology and the occult sciences been stashed because they don't belong to that canon. And so, you know, that's why work with manuscripts is important, because you're literally going into like the dark pits and taking out these manuscripts, kind of like the emerald tablet, over and over again.
Exactly.
You know, it is a quest. It really is. When you go to a library and you just take this text on magic that, you know, have been stashed for a long time, it is like that crypt, that hermetic crypt where you walk in and it's all dark and windy and there's no way to perceive it. But the spirit, the ruhaniya of her mistress Megistus, comes up and says, you know, just turn on the light, cover it, and then dig at the corner, and there you will find the emerald tablet. We do that in a way.
Yes, it's magic in itself.
Yes,
It is
yes.
magic in itself.
So, you know,
We agree with you.
yeah, and I also, like, again, Professor Charles Burnett, you know, was instrumental in me recognizing that it is a hermetic quest, being an academic who's writing on science.
I couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
And it's so intensely fascinating that we just cannot stop.
Yeah.
That's the other thing.
Yeah.
Okay.
An eternal puzzle.
Yes.
Yeah. Okay, so I think
we could stay here forever.
Yes, we could.
But it doesn't help that we're friends.
No, it doesn't. So, Liana, thank you very much for this conversation.
It was fascinating.
It was very good to talk to you about these things, and
you are welcome to return if you have like a manuscript, an idea, a talisman, something that you want to talk about.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be like a formal interview. It could be like 10 minutes. Just look at this.
Yeah, a quarter of an hour.
You're very welcome. Just send us a message, and you're welcome to return.
Noted, for sure.
You're welcome. Goodbye for now.
Yes, and thank you for being with us, and best of luck with your translations and your research.
Thank you so much, and I'm sure we'll have more occasions to talk more.